number one, ring. Missing a ring already here. Probably from the last class. Any more documents you'll have to identify. Also, does this look like anybody's? That was a couple weeks back, and so I had a little dilatory back to whoever it is. And then Danielle and I.
So hello everybody. I have two announcements. We have a roundtable today. Dr. Morrison will actually close the roundtable at 4 p.m. at the Barrel Room. And please try to attend this film that we're actually going to be projecting to the FYE community, Gattaca, that is scheduled for November the 16th at 6 p.m. at the Cooperage. And that's also in this flyer that we distributed at the community.
Thank you very much. We also have a question from our beloved Shannon Cosgrave.
Hi everyone. So you guys all got this flyer and this card that we passed out to you guys about Mental Health Awareness Week, which is taking place November 9th to the 12th. So we just really want to encourage you guys to fill out a message on the other side of this card. It's to, uplift, encourage, and be supportive of people that have claimed their lives to suicide or are just going through a lot of things. So anyways, this is just something we want to really encourage you guys to do. There's a lot of events going on that week that you can use as a community engagement. I'm going to be hosting a movie screening of that documentary Happy on Monday night. So that information will follow, but please take this into consideration. Thank you.
And we hope that your professors and your staff continue to tell you about events that are coming up. And Shannon is a really important mover and taker about this event on campus. A lot of gratitude about Shannon. Please, as ever, take out your phone, turn it off, and remember the incivility of having a split screen next to you. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Amanda Morrison, Amanda Martinez. Our lecturer for today, a very distinguished lecturer, if I may say. I love doing this job because I get to know virtually, or at least more than I do so by seeing her on campus, the wonderful people that we have working with, speaking to us. So Amanda Martinez Morrison, PhD, is from the University of Texas at Austin in cultural anthropology. She's a faculty member in our Department of Latino Studies. I think among other, you've been a faculty of several.
Anthropology and names, yes.
Right, exactly. She's all kinds of really interesting research about Latino, Latina identity and popular culture, in areas like hip hop, chick lit, and published articles about all kinds of really good stuff. She's won a number of very prestigious research fellowships and is a very active public intellectual, working a great deal, for instance, in publishing popular press, I think politically oriented magazines and newspapers and things like that. And with that, let's give Dr. Amanda Martinez Morrison a rousing hand.
You can call me Dr. M. It's a mouthful. I started hyphenating with the Martinez because in Chicano studies people sometimes want to authenticate your Latinidad or your Chicanidad, so I added the hyphen. But Dr. M, is fine. I really enjoy giving this lecture. It's been a few years now, so we'll kind of dive into the novel. You've started reading Oscar Wilde, right? So we'll dive into it. We're kind of in an introductory phase of it, or Dr. Malpica has already lectured. We'll be talking about race again, probably, a little bit to do with immigration patterns, but also colonialism, and talk a little bit about gender, and also this idea that I think is really productive and expansive of cultural hybridity, but it's not without its controversy. Ooh, can I give a little plug? The Cows Department's having a party. This is not related, but it is related because Dia de los Muertos is popping right now on campus. Last year there was like no parties. This year there's about 5 parties. There's in the Spanish department, the Latina sorority, all different. So the Cows is having our own party on Thursday in the afternoon. We would really love to see some of y'all there. If you haven't been to the Hub yet, that's a good opportunity to come to the Hub, check out what goes on there. It's a multicultural, really cool, vital space on campus. So there's my little plug. okay? I want to kind of situate you in Junot Diaz's world. And he has all these kooky phrases. Well, they're not so kooky if you're sort of in culture, although he makes some of them up. He's got a lot of slang, right? Some really controversial slang, which I'll probably talk about in the round table. But among the slang is this kind of hip-hop inflected tone he has, and one is a identity marker, doyo, which simply means the longer version of that condensation is Dominican York. So folks, there's a big population of Dominicanos, or people of Dominican descent, from the Dominican Republic, in the New York metro area. And for our purposes, we need to kind of broaden. When you think of New York, you probably think of Manhattan. A lot of people think of Manhattan, which is just one of the 5 boroughs, and the city proper. But we need to kind of expand and create a little bit of a metro area mental map, or a physical map here, to expand into New Jersey. So he's, a lot of the, Oscar Wilde, the character, his life is set in Paterson, New Jersey, and it's just across the bridge. In fact, it's across the bridge that the first time I gave this lecture, there was this whole Bridgegate thing with Chris Christie. He purposely jammed up the bridge to make a political opponent look bad or something, or that's the accusation. But it brings up this idea of bridges versus boundaries. So cultural flows. So bridging, think of bridges as a metaphor so that culture can flow across disparate areas, okay? So in a way, the map kind of provides a little bit of a mental map too of circulating culture, circulating cultural influences even within this New York metro area. So the author, Junot Diaz, is just an extremely savvy, urban, cultural critic, just kind of hip guy, even though he's, more my age. You're not super hip if you're, in your 40s or whatever, but, he has all these cultural and kind of youth cultural, subcultural references that he makes that are kind of rooted in this New York metro area. So yeah, I think a lot of times Californians don't know a lot about the more prominent Latino populations out east, unless some of you are from back east. We're much more situated in a Mexican American Latino population, or it's kind of dominated by Mexican Americans because that's just the settlement pattern here. And let's face it, this used to be Mexico, orale, right? So it kind of follows, although we have a big population of Central Americans or people of Central American descent. But back east, as you might just kind of know, just from being alive in the world, it's more people from the Caribbean. The Latino population is more historically drawn from the Caribbean islands, so Puerto Rico, which, that's not immigration, that's part of the US. Dominican Republic, to some extent, parts of Colombia, other islander populations. So that's kind of what I want to situate and familiarize yourself a little bit, because this category of Latino is emerging as useful as an umbrella category, but under that there's all these people here, of US Latinos with very different national origin heritages and cultures. Even if you weren't born outside the US, like if your parents or grandparents or whatever were from any of these Latin American areas, that means you're inheriting cultural forms possibly that are pretty distinct to whatever that sending nation is. I did want to say though, what's interesting about the East Coast now, and Dr. Malpico knows a lot about this too, is that Mexicans are settling in the New York area a lot. I mean, they have been for decades, but there is a big Mexican population, so that's adding to the mix of the East Coast. But you kind of, a lot of the culture that the Latino culture that comes out of the New York area is rooted very much in a kind of Caribbean island diaspora, okay? So just to kind of think of, okay, who in popular culture or public culture, who's Dominican out there, right? So these are some of the people I thought of off the top of my head. Zoe Saldana, Oscar de la Renta, the famous fashion designer who passed a few years ago, A-Rod, right? Sammy Sosa. I use this picture purposely because there's something funky going on here. Anyone follow Sammy Sosa's career? What is this to this? There's some kind of fuku going on here, okay? There's some kind of blanqueamiento a whitening, kind of like Michael Jackson, right? All of a sudden, Sammy Sosa started turning up real pale looking, like he was somehow applying some kind of chemical to his face or makeup or something. And I don't know the backstory, I don't know what he's up to, but it does trigger something for me, which is that Dominicanos, like many Latinos, and like pretty much everyone in this post-colonial world we live in, have some funkiness inherited around race and, frankly, white supremacy. So sometimes even communities of color will internalize really old beliefs that go all the way back to Cristobal Columbus in 1492, you know, where Europeans conquered much of the sort of global south, or what some people call the third world, and kind of pulled a number, the people in power pulled a number on the rest of the world of like, European culture is civilized, your culture is savage or barbaric or lesser than. And then that, over hundreds of years, that gets internalized, or even communities of color start to believe that somehow white is right, or more European or white is somehow preferable and more beautiful. You have all kinds of funk going on with, in a lot of communities of color, of, you know, you want straight hair, you want lighter skin. This is colonialism. We have not shucked that off. We're still in that stuff, okay? So that's pointing to something, especially with Dominicanos, and that's Junot Diaz himself, who has become a kind of celebrity in and of itself. In the Dominican Republic, you kind of have to look anthropologically at all the different Latino national origin groups. Everyone has their own distinct history and way of dealing with the fuku of colonialism and European supremacy and racism. Dominican Republic has some distinctive attributes. One is that a lot of people in the DR can't deal with blackness at all, are in total denial. And a few of your sections already watched Skip Gates's Black in Latin America, the episode on the DR and Haiti, right? A few of you watch it. Just doesn't look like maybe many. Or maybe you didn't remember, but I remember. Something really distinct happens there when Dr. Gates is walking along the calle and he's talking to a scholar from the DR, and they see like a really racist figurine of like a Afro, you know, Latina kind of doll figure. And obviously there's something racial remnants going on there. No one wants to talk about it. And he says, literally, in the Dominican Republic, no one refers to themselves as black or negro. Like, or maybe not no one, but the majority do not. Even though, because of the slave trade, I would say I think the majority of the population has African ancestry, and to Americanize would look quote unquote black. But people won't identify as black there typically. Then they do a weird move, a little Jedi move of like, I'm Indio, which certainly people in Latin America mostly have Indian ancestry too, native ancestry. But they just won't kind of utter or cop to, not that it's a cop, but like in their fukud racial, you know, remnants of colonialism, blackness is denied. And it causes a lot of problems because a lot of people from the Dominican Republic, I mean, you know, in the way we kind of judge, you know, ocularly, the optics of it, dark skin, you kind of are like, oh, that person looks black, right? And that's what you would say about a lot of Dominicanos, but there's not a claiming of black identity. And so for Junot Diaz's characters, they're grappling with that in the New York area, where in a context where the United States has its own fuku, right? The United States has its own stuff we haven't worked through around race and racism. So the question is, you know, are these celebrities black? Well, in the Dominicano context, it's something quite complex. And then the question to ask is Oscar Wilde black? And so we don't really, you know, I don't think it's a clear, it's kind of by nature not a clear answer, because race is such a slippery category, has no scientific basis, but it's a social construct. It's a complex category. But I would tell you this, Oscar and the characters in the novel are dealing with and confronting their relationship to blackness, among other things. So yeah, I'm talking about Henry Louis Gates' series. Please, I would really encourage any sections who haven't watched the, I think, half-hour segment on the DR and Haiti to screen it. And then, so I mean, what part of the dilemma in the Dominican Republic is this kind of denial of African ancestry on an island. This is the island that Christopher Columbus bumped up onto. He was very confused. He wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. And he kind of like came to the Bahamas and thought he was in India, and then he came to Hispaniola. But Hispaniola is the Dominican Republic nation state and Haiti. Now, Haiti is proudly a black nation. Haitians proudly claim that identity. Haiti was the first nation in the colonial era to organize a slave revolt that actually booted the French out and claim their own independence. Now, of course, France and later the United States punished Haiti for that kind of insubordination through all kinds of economic and military means, but Haiti fully embraces that. And because of the sugar plantations in Haiti, you have an even more African ancestry or black population in Haiti. But guess what? Those folks commonly come over to the Dominican Republic to work in factories and farms, and right? They're kind of like that's the immigrant, the undocumented immigrant population. The dynamic we typically think of here is Mexicans coming over here, taking our jobs. There's all that kind of xenophobic discourse. That's the dynamic in the DR. Haitians, undocumented, illegal aliens coming over here and threatening our national culture too much. In a sense, most people, including Junot Diaz, would say this is racist. They're saying we don't want blackness. We're rejecting blackness. So he's saying that the nation, his parent nation, is fundamentally racist. And some interesting stuff went on this summer. I don't know if any of you caught this. It was in the news. Probably should have been covered more. Junot Diaz, actually, he's one of the most celebrated literary figures in the world today. This young guy who wrote this dope novel, and people, young and old, black and white, and everything in between, they really love Oscar Wilde. The Dominican Republic kind of claimed him as the prodigal son, gave him a big award, a medal. Guess what they said? Nope. A couple days ago, they took it back because they did not like that he was criticized. They said the things he was speaking out against, what happened, he was speaking out against some policies. He loves his parent nation, he loves the people, but he's speaking out against some what he feels are racist and xenophobic policies that have recently been enacted in the Dominican Republic. One was the attempt to deport hundreds and thousands of undocumented Haitians, round them up, send them over. I'm not sure about how widespread they've actually done that, but it's a state of threat and terror right now for a lot of immigrants, black Haitians. And then the other thing, this is really nuts, is that they stripped the children of those immigrants of their Dominican citizenship. So that's like saying if your parents came over here without papers, but you were born here, you were born in Glendale, California, you're not a citizen anymore, which is what Trump has said he'd like to do. But they did it. They did it. So Junot Diaz spoke out, and now he's not so much the favored son of the Dominican Republic. So you can see there's a lot of fuku there. All right. But this stuff goes way, way back, 500 years. And so when we talk about blackness in Latin America, we often, anywhere in the post-colonial era, we talk about diasporas. Diaspora, like I think it's a Latin root, spora, means seed actually, which is kind of cool and productive. It's like you have a handful of seeds and you spread them out, diaspora. But it's not quite so quaint as that. But it does mean a spreading of people through typically a displacement that is violent, through persecution, oppression, force, displacement where people spread out from an original homeland. Now, the word was for, like the first part of the 20th century, people tended to use it to talk about, scholars tended to use it to talk about the Jewish diaspora, which is like thousands of years old of Jews being persecuted all over the world, throughout Eurasia, into, all the way through the World War II era. So, but back to the biblical era. But today, more commonly, it's become a very useful term to apply to people with African ancestry all over the world, especially the Americas. So there's people of African ancestry all throughout the American hemisphere, not just here in the United States, as a result of slavery. Now, slavery, some of the most sort of pernicious chattel slavery, plantation type exploitation of workers happen here in the States, yeah, cotton plantations and all that, but also in the Caribbean. Haiti, Cuba, Puerto Rico, right? So, because these were where the big sugar plantations were, and among other cash crops, but sugar particularly made England and France filthy rich. It's not that hard to get rich when you don't pay your workers anything. You can kind of extract a lot of profits when you don't pay your workers. So they made those empires filthy rich, and it was just a devastating era that, you know, took all the way through for us, the Civil War, to get rid of slavery, and we're still dealing with the remnants or the fuku of it, right? So, but this applies to the entire American hemisphere. Every nation in the American hemisphere has some funk they're still dealing with. Now, the funk I'm talking about, the fuku, the kind of curse that we're still carrying around, is this kind of psychological and sociological baggage. It has been talked about in very different terms. I would say there's a big contrast between how the US talks about race relations, which is all rooted in our colonial history, and how most of the Latin American nations do. There's this really interesting contrast where we've always conceptualized things, and we're having to challenge that now, as a binary. Who knows what a binary is? What's an example of a binary? You guys are supposed to be savvy, you know, digital age kids, right? It's a binary. Never heard that term? Code, does anyone code? No? I thought your all generation was going to be like the ones who invent all the apps and everything. Like a binary is an either or, ones and zeros. So right, all digital code is rooted in a binary of ones and zeros. Or black and white, male, female, gay, straight, those kinds of binaries. United States is, I don't know, might have something to do with our British history and the Enlightenment philosophers that we kind of inherited, and maybe puritanical, Anglo-Saxon, I don't know why, but we tend to think of things in binaries here. In Latin America, for race, there's so much beyond black and white. There's all these interstitial categories, these in-between categories. So, we have like, these are common: mestizo, mulatto, morena, prieta, jalao, trigueña, cocolo. I think the last three are unique to the DR. So I'm not very familiar with them, but they're all kinds of just this obsession with kind of racial taxonomies. It's very different from the US, although we had some weird ones like back in the, you know, the ante and postbellum era of like octoroon and stuff like that. We have some of that, but in Latin America, the model of talking about race, it's really not any more progressive or anti-racist, but it's just includes these kind of mixed race categories, an acknowledgement of mixed race as an identity, many different, and the term is mestizaje, mestizaje. What that means is, oh, and I always want to mention though, so in the black-white binary way, like, you know, when we talk, oh, what's the problem of race in America? Oh, black people and white people, is just no inequality. Well, hi, Latinos are, you know, where do we fit in this conversation? Right? Because our communities are racialized too, and it's a big growing population, and sometimes we have more privileges than African Americans here in the States. Our skin's lighter, different histories. So there's definitely differences, but if you just have a binary, then this important category drops out. So does, you know, Asian Americans too. We don't have a discourse, but I do want to point to the way in which, especially here in the States, Latinos have been subject to similar kinds of racism and racial terror as African Americans. Maybe there's questions of degree, but the same kind of Jim Crow laws, lynchings, yes, right? So we have so there's a shared history between Latinos and African Americans in the US that often gets lost. Okay, but in the Latin American context, the metaphor is one of mixing, and they had these casta charts during the colonial era. These literally say like Indian plus white equals criollo, or, you know, like there's all these weird categories and stuff that if you got married, or the church would have a chart to say, okay, if this person with this race mixes with this person, this mixed race, then they equal this. And it wasn't to like celebrate interracial love. It was to track the racial hierarchy to make sure that people of pure blood, or, you know, people of European descent stayed at the top. So we need, okay, people are mixing and we're acknowledging it, but we got to make sure this is a hierarchy. It's not just like a chart that's neutral, it's a hierarchy. The more European at the top, the blacker at the bottom, and then all these middle categories. So it's a kind of obsession with race as a kind of scopophilic or like surveillance approach to race. Let's make it almost like a science, like a taxonomical system. Okay, but mestizaje today, I kind of reclaim it. You know, mestizo, yeah, mestizo meant someone who is a child of a Spaniard and a Native American in Latin America. But it also, the root of the word is mezclar, to mix. And some of my colleagues, because it's so charged with this, you know, horrible, traumatic racial history, don't even like to use the term mestizo or mestizaje as a positive in any way, as a kind of stand-in for a kind of mixed culture or mixed race identity, because it's too charged from that colonial baggage. But I'm more of the opinion that I think you can kind of use it today to talk about, because for me, like, I am a product of a very mixed background. Like, my dad he's a white dude, he's a gringo. And my mom is Chicana. Oh, but by being Chicana, she has part Spanish ancestry and part Native American ancestry. Maybe some black in there too, we don't really know, don't know all that stuff. But I experience life as someone who feels very mixed or in between. So I kind of embrace these categories while acknowledging the baggage and the trauma that it comes out in. So mestizaje specifically could refer to the cultural mixing. This is where we get into Junot Diaz's world in terms of race, but also the culture he comes from. It's the process of cultural mixing that accompanied all this racial stuff that was going on in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, right, in the colonial era. And then the more neutral term, they're not quite similes, but I think they're in the same sort of semantic domain, would be cultural hybridity. So this doesn't carry so much baggage from the it's not like a term that comes out of the colonial era of the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. It's more kind of modern. We're probably familiar with the term hybrid, right? Priuses, vines that you splice together to create some other wine that's going to make you all this money in your wine business classes or whatever. So hybridity becomes a new metaphor, or kind of a similar way to talk about people with very mixed, not only ancestries, but contemporary cultural influences. And that's how I see Junot Diaz. This is my little, let's see, well, so I would say the New York metro area is a kind of metro mezcla, or mix, okay? And the particular nodes I like to highlight, I would say, are the Bronx, Harlem, Washington Heights, and yeah, Jersey. This is my little cultural map of that. So Harlem has such an amazing, rich cultural history that Diaz is definitely drawing from. He's a cultural critic and scholar and author. He knows his music. He loves music. He knows his literature. He knows all these cultural forms, and he's really juiced by ones that come out of, you know, his terrain. And so he would be familiar with, like, the Harlem Renaissance writers, Langston Hughes or Neil Hurston, right? And also that was the jazz era. So that is very rooted in a specific neighborhood in New York that's still a really vital part of New York, Harlem. It's getting gentrified now, but it has historically been the neighborhood associated with black culture. And the arts, and working class black culture. Also, but over to the east, I think a lot of people miss this, but East Harlem, or El Barrio, or Spanish Harlem, is also a very traditional settlement for a long time now, since like the 1950s especially, 40s, 50s, of Puerto Ricans, who he refers to as Puerto Rocks, or Puerto Rocks. I think he would say Puerto Rocks. The reason for that is because he's also influenced by hip-hop. Hip-hop was born and bred, I would say, to some extent in Harlem, among Puerto Rican and black kids, but white kids too. It was kind of multiracial, but especially in the Bronx, same populations. Puerto Ricans, African Americans, working class whites created this culture together. So one of the most famous breakdancing crews, the Rocksteady crew, they refer to themselves as Puerto Rocks. And that's Junot Diaz is drawing from that. He grew up admiring that kind of dance. Also from East Harlem, I think he has a little bit of a salsa rhythm to his work. So salsa music is not, it's not like some quaint folkloric music from Cuba or even Puerto Rico. It's got roots there. Salsa is these badasses, right? Salsa is these kind of like gritty Puerto Rican, Harlem and Bronx guys. A lot of them immigrated from Puerto Rico, but they're into the whole kind of urban culture too. Salsa emerged in New York in the 1970s. And then also the Dominican aspect. A lot of people don't know this as much, more familiar with Puerto Rican culture than Dominicano, but Washington Heights area, even further up from Harlem, that's where there's a big settlement of Dominicanos. And I kind of like think through that with, remember reggaeton? No? Reggaeton. Raise your hand if you've heard of reggaeton. Right, okay. It was like a flash in the pan, yeah, I don't know, whatever, it's kind of come and gone. But it was a big trend for a little while, especially among US Latino youth, right? And so some of the most well-known performers and producers of the reggaeton moment are Dominicanos from this area, like Looney Tunes. They're behind all those Daddy Yankee songs and all that. The Dominicano guys. I'll talk about Aventura in a second. Okay. I know Dr. Rumsberg is going to talk about gender, but I did want to point something out here in terms of cultural types or figures, or if you will, stereotypes. So there's that rich cultural brew or mix that Junot Diaz is drawing from in all his vernacular, his referencing, just the vibe of his novel. But there's also this interesting thing around masculinity, and all I want to say here is, you ever heard of the stereotype of the Latin lover? Some of y'all may benefit from that, like this idea that Latino men are like the best lovers or whatever, and some people only want to date Latino men, and I think all that stuff is weird, and I think when you date exclusively a race, like some people want to just date, like some hetero men want to only date Asian women, and I think that's racist personally, but it's up to you to decide. Let's all be equal opportunity lovers. But yeah, there's this fetish around Latino masculinity that's been around for a while, especially maybe in previous pop culture. I don't know about today. Maybe it's not as strong or pernicious of a stereotype, but there's all these guys. It goes back to these movies from the early era of Hollywood, these Latin lover figures, Rudy Valentino, and there are some Mexican actors as well. If you're familiar with Mexican music, I think Chente and his son Alejandro, they really play up that they were very tight pants and all that. And then Antonio Banderas has been getting all the Latin lover roles for like 30 years. It's like, come on, you're getting old. Like, give some other like Chicano actor a chance or something. But because he's from Spain, but he has the look. He definitely has the look, right? Rico Suave look. And then there's the Iglesiases, which is interesting because they're not Latino either, they're Spanish. It depends on how you define Latino. But Julio was the original crooner, and my grandpa liked him a lot. But now it's Enrique, his son, right? So it's this like sexy, suave Latin lover thing. And I think Oscar Wilde is butting up against that all the time because he's a dork. Put it bluntly, you know? He's a nerd, right? I do want to point out, some of you might recognize this, the newest, hottest Latin lovers on the, as far as I can tell, although I'm getting old and not in touch with everything, but in the music world, guess who are the hottest Latin lovers? They're Dominicanos. So, you recognize these guys? Romeo Santos, Prince Royce, all this bachata stuff. If you don't recognize it, then you probably don't live among very many Latinos. Let's just put it that way. Because when these guys come and do their CD signings at a Walmart or whatever, or have a concert, they're selling out arenas here in the United States. They're super big on the Billboard charts, and so if you're not familiar with them, that just tells me we're very segregated still, because they're very huge pop stars, and they're Dominicano. Whoa, that was for effect. But you'll see that Junot, Oscar's compatriot, his sister's ex-boyfriend, I think, Junot, who kind of fits the Latin lover mold. Little bad boy, is always, like kind of promiscuous. He's always after women and kind of conquest attitude about women. He's like he's following the stereotype. He's modeling his masculinity on that. And Oscar is like, oh, God. Oscar is just like, what am I supposed to do? And Junior is always telling him, Oscar, you're not a real Dominicano. And I think that has something to do with this very stereotyped notion of what Dominicano masculinity, in a kind of heteronormative hyper masculinity, hyper sort of female conquest kind of sexuality. And he's falling short. This is his world. This is Oscar's world, right? 40-year-old virgins, fanboys, Sheldon. That's Oscar's world. It's a fascinating world, and I think, as an anthropologist, I think it'd be fun to do. There's actually some emergent ethnographies on like nerd culture, and I think nerds are getting a little bit of a renaissance right now. They get a little more respect. Nerds are becoming like CEOs of Silicon Valley companies, and Comic-Con went from a nerd fest to like one of the hottest festivals around. So. Let's keep that, and that's an interesting backdrop, this kind of what you would call nerd culture. This kind of obsessive cataloging and kind of bedroom culture of like my figurines and my sci-fi novels and my comics and my, it's a kind of obsessive, people obsessed with popular culture, but not the kind of popular culture that the kids from the mainstream or the popular kids are into. But they don't care. To some extent, there's self-consciousness around it, but it's also like, I don't relate to mainstream pop. We have our own kind of insular world, right? So that's something to keep in mind, and I think around gender, because oftentimes, these kinds of characters, as quote-unquote nerd culture becomes portrayed in our mainstream sitcoms and movies and stuff, they're always portrayed as people who, quote-unquote, can't get laid, right? People who are sort of sexually neutered. So that's something that Oscar is struggling with as well. This perceptions of him as not living up to the masculine code his community values. What else? One more thing, tied off of that. Back to the Fuku. I think that because Junot Diaz, as much as he's the kind of celebrity, literary celebrity, public intellectual these days, he loves like hip hop culture and salsa and the more kind of like things that are seen in their time that were very, very hip youth culture. But the author himself is really into sci-fi fantasy and that kind of stuff too. So he's a mix, right? Even his cultural influences, he's got both going on, the kind of hip stuff and the kind of dorky stuff, and he's kind of like working it all together. That's part of who he is, and he's unashamed of it. So I think he works in tropes of sci-fi fantasy books and movies, like Star Trek, Star Wars. Everyone's so juiced for Star Wars, and it's really great that Star Wars is finally casting some actors of color, right? So I'm sure Junot Diaz is like, yes, because he's very much a kind of, like anti-racist public intellectual. So some of these ideas that you find in sci-fi movies and comics and novels, evil overlords and demons, and in the book it's ciguapas or enchantresses, sirenas, right? Women, the kind of enchantresses that are drawing you in, and it's definitely not very gender progressive, but curses, right? I put a curse on you, kind of like in like Harry Potter or something. In this case, it's Fuku, and the person who put a curse is Trujillo. Phantasms, phantasmagoria, that's the sense you find it in a lot of Latin American literature and cultural production. They call it like lo real maravilloso, or the magical realism. This sense of like, okay, your setting is ordinary life, but there's something a little bit spooky or psychedelic or uncanny or off about the world. A lot of Latin American writers have really mined that terrain of like, there's phantasms in the Bronx apartment, you know? There's ghosts, right? There's weird figures haunting. There's a sense of hauntedness. And so I think he's using that as a trope to compare the, like Darth Vader. Well, Trujillo was a pretty close approximation to Darth Vader, to tell you the truth. Trujillo was the president, or you know, the dictator of the Dominican Republic. He disappeared a lot of people. And that's what Oscar's mom is still dealing with, that trauma. You can think of him as Darth Vader if you like, except he doesn't want to be black, he wants to be white. And you'll see that in the video. Trujillo tried to whiten his skin to look more European. And I think you can think of like the conquest of all the conquistadores coming into Latin America with their crazy, you know, like metal armor and, you know, like the genocide of Native Americans. I think that's at the level of just incredible tragedy that you would find in a sci-fi novel. These outsiders who look bizarre to the natives coming in and colonizing these outer colonies, right? And doing horrible, you know, these evil overlords, you know, the sense of apocalypses, falls, coming to a new world like you would in like exploring Mars or exploring far off planets, like Gattaca, I guess. Gattaca is a sci-fi, you're gonna be watching that, right? So keep those kind of tropes in mind. I mean, truth is stranger than fiction. The stuff that went down in this era was so grotesque and so violent, you can't make it up, right? The kind of subjugation and violence that occurred. You like violent movies that are, you know, fantasy, fiction, but the actual violence that happened in the last 500 years rivals any fiction you will come across. So I think that's a trope here, sci-fi, fantasy, applied to actual, real, lived experience and memory of what happened. Okay, that's it, es todo. Gracias.
Gathering questions now. Anybody who has a question on just by all means, if you want to write a question right now, go for it. We have some peer mentors gathering some questions right now. I have one while they're doing that.
Okay.
So just be quiet. I like to make sure that we've been clear about our terms. Would you just gloss the term xenophobia for us, please?
Sure. Xenophobia is often spoken in the same breath as racism, but it's got a kind of distinct denotation. It really means fear of the foreign. So fear of the other, fear of the foreign. Now foreign can be a little more, it doesn't have to be like a person who is of a different race than you, but typically xenophobia comes up in context of people who are really concerned about particularly immigrants coming into your nation or region. Xenophobia, fear of the foreign. Instead of embrace of the foreign. Hey, new people, new culture, supposed to be a melting pot, all that kind of discourse. Xenophobia would be the opposite.
All right. And when they read the question, would you repeat the question?
Sure.
So, do you think this whitening of people of color is reversible? If so, how should it be done?
Whitening of people of color is reversible. Okay. Well, yeah, like for someone today in the contemporary context, someone like Sammy Sosa, if I'm to impugn what he's doing, which I don't really know what he's doing, but say he thought his dark skin and his texture of hair was ugly. And that comes up a lot in communities of color. I think the antidote, to use sci-fi terminology, the antidote would be educating yourself, engaging in rituals and practices that valorize your identity and where you come from, taking ethnic studies classes if you're lucky enough to go to college, where you learn that who you are, where you come from, is not something to be shameful of, but something to be proud of. The incredible resilience, especially Afro-diasporic populations, including African Americans here. If you think about how many cultural forms have stayed alive despite abject subjugation and violence, how resilient African Americans are and Afro-Latinos are, keeping their rhythms alive, keeping their music alive, keeping their ideas alive, keeping their stories alive, literally stuff you can trace back to Africa through griots and drumming patterns, still here in hip-hop, blues, soul music. That is something to be proud of. So it's just a matter of connecting with that, and that will be your antidote.
Why do you think the U.S. saw race as a black-white binary? Do you think the U.S. still sees race that way?
I want you guys to think through that. My understanding, like in a historical sense, is that so our original 13 colonies, the empire was England, right? And it was kind of, you know, Anglo-Saxon, Puritan, British culture kind of was coming from a more binaristic kind of heaven, hell, you know, immanence versus transcendence, good, bad, right? And it's kind of Enlightenment thought. That I don't mean to make it seem so simplistic. I mean, Enlightenment philosophy is very nuanced and it's good stuff. It's good philosophy, but there's kind of a more proclivity towards either ors, right? Kind of moralistic, you're either good or bad, saint or sinner. And in the Latin American context, I mean, I don't know if there's some difference there. Also, I don't know why, but the Spanish colonial authorities didn't have such severe violent prohibitions on mixing, if you will. They just tried to track it through casta charts. But here in the United States, literally, if you even, like Emmett Till, this was 1950 something, he winked at a white woman. And he was killed for that. He didn't date her, he didn't have sex with her, he winked at her. And he was lynched for that. So our policing of racial boundaries has actually been, I think, more strident. Not to say it's all great in the Latin American context, though.
What do you think Oscar identifies as?
What do I think? I think you're seeing a character being developed who is going through a transformation. So I think he doesn't have a clear, he's a Dominicano kid from New Jersey. He experiences himself as racialized, as non-white, but he doesn't have a lot of connection. I think maybe his mom doesn't maybe talk about a lot of stuff from the DR because her background is so trauma-based, you know? And so, he eventually goes and lives with his sort of the grandmother figure on the island. So he's coming to a sense of identity as, I would say probably something more like a mulatto or mestizo identity, but a Dominicano identity and a working through of, his Afro-Latino heritage. But I think he always stays in a complex place where it's not like he arrives at blackness. It's never going to be that simple. He also has indigenous heritage. He also has Spanish heritage.
Thank you.
Thanks.